Thank you, Brad, and it's a gorgeous segue into sort of, we're done the pinning of the line with questions, if you will. I wanted to invite our panelists, though, to speak with one another and share some dialogue with the group about some of the resilience challenges that we anticipate will face our mutual cities and how we can potentially work together as in the interest of 100 resilient cities, putting 4 Canadian cities into the network. So maybe all 4 of you, I can just, it's open mic, if you will.
I'll go.
Sure.
So I think that from an immediate perspective, we could definitely, we have an opportunity to collaborate, not just as cities within the 100 Resilient Cities Network, but as municipalities, towns, communities across Canada to address response to the opioid crisis, but also to think very strategically about the root causes of that crisis. And to that end, I think that I personally don't think that any resilient strategy is going to be effective unless it is underpinned with a conversation around equity and social justice. Because resilience can't just be for the rich. And while we need to think about our response to the opioid crisis, we also need to think about the conditions and the factors that got us into this mess, and to be thinking and sharing information really strategically about how we can get out of it. Another key aspect of that, where we can use national, federal, and provincial support, will be around the collection and analysis of data so that we really understand what's happening across our cities and have evidence with which to build policies and actions to support a strong response.
One of the things that we talked about, we had a little bit of a discussion this morning before coming over. One of the things that we have been working on that is still a piece of work in progress that I think that we can work on together is really where we're going with our Indigenous framework. The City of Calgary's put a lot of time and effort into an Indigenous policy. We've been meeting with the administration, traditional knowledge keepers, leaders from all the Treaty 7 nations. We've still got some work to do, but I think that is one area, that is just one area we must succeed in. It's just not an option. It is so critical that we succeed not just as a city, but that we succeed as a region, that we succeed with all of the groups, all of the stakeholders that are around us. And that is one of the areas that I think that is pretty common to all of us, that we can share what we have done. I think there's many learnings that are able to have. So that's something that I fear sometimes that when we join new associations or we get off, it can be perceived as a tangent or something. That's not what this is for us and for the City of Calgary. It's really about how we can bring more focus to bear on some of our most critical topics, and that is one of them. Extending that relationship, being part of the carrying on the spirit of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is something that we all bear a responsibility for across Canada, and that will be for sure one of the things that I think we'll be talking about in the days and weeks to come. Yeah, absolutely. We were discussing it earlier. I mean, as a portion of population, Indigenous groups are 3 or 4 times higher in Calgary and in Vancouver than in Toronto, and it's a major opportunity, I think, for Toronto. It's one that just fits so naturally when you think about the concept of resilience. One of the things that I wanted to raise was, we talk a lot about working within Team Canada and the 4 cities, but I think we really want to work also with the cities and towns, municipalities, which are surrounding Toronto, which aren't part of the network. To look at it from a Toronto-specific lens would basically be to fall into the old trap of thinking that wildlife and air and water and indeed people just fit neatly within our city borders. We know that they don't. Water is a good example where I think we come together and we cooperate with the municipalities surrounding Toronto, but really to try to extend this, I mean, we have to deal with the city as a first priority, but try and extend it into some sort of regional resilience cooperation, perhaps starting from the ecological side where the argument is a bit more obvious, but then moving into more contentious issues like transportation and economy.
Katya, any suggestions on how Team Canada can best leverage the use of the network and things that you're hearing us talk about? Are there other countries where you've put a couple of cities in together and asked them are they as Team Canada focused as
I think there's
as our
nothing
team
quite
is?
like Team Canada, I have to say. This is a pretty unique amalgamation of pretty phenomenal cities. I will say on Elliot's last point, I mean, I think this is something lots of cities are grappling with, is this jurisdictional boundary issue, right? So the issue in Pittsburgh, for instance, the issue of wastewater. They have a major CSO, combined sewer overflow issue. They have a consent decree with our EPA to respond. It's a $5 billion consent decree. Basically, every time they get a tenth of an inch of rain, they have raw sewage flowing into their rivers. So there's a lot of areas like that where there's shared responsibility. For Melbourne, this strategy, their resilience strategy, was the first strategy they've ever worked on in 180 years, where they had 32 local councils come together and plan for a future, a sort of roadmap to what their future resilience would look like as 32 local councils. So I think this issue of jurisdictional boundaries, of what's in your appreciable interest as a city, I mean, I think what's interesting here is that for Team Canada, something like the opioid crisis, which is just as catastrophic right now in the US, I've heard numerous times that health funding is at the provincial level. So how you all can band together and try to influence policy and draw down funding in a way to be able to impact what's happening in your cities and on your borders is going to be really critical. So I would say that, yeah, I think there's lots of cities around the world, Chile as well, Santiago de Chile, same issue around municipalities and borders and what's in their control and what isn't, and just the realization, the acknowledgement that they're going to have to draw down federal resources and federal partnerships in order to be able to carry out a lot of the resilience work they want to do.
Just maybe a word on that in the Calgary context. Again, just something that we may have looked at as a challenge about being able to reach across our borders. That's a reality and an opportunity that now confronts us here in Calgary. We are going to have the opportunity to participate as part of a regional growth management board that is coming to a district close to all of us. This is something that we have been advocating for quite some time, to not take a look at the growth challenges and all of the other challenges and opportunities that come with it as an island. We are going to have to be able to look at these cross-jurisdictional issues, particularly at the administrative level, and talk about how we change planning, talk about how we change the construct of communities to be able to achieve many of the other social outcomes that we want to achieve. So we look forward to that. That is something that's going to be coming to us, as I said, in the near months to come.
Brad, I think you raise an important point, which is looking at those other jurisdictions and the relationship that cities are having. It feels more and more that we have a requirement as a municipality to provide services to our citizens with fewer and fewer resources and more downloading, if you will, from other orders of government. It also, though, then requires us to be more resilient as an organization. So as a community, yes, and also as a city. And I'm just wondering if any of you, I know in the city of Calgary, we've started to talk about that organizational resilience. Katie, you and both you and Elliot have referenced the need to work together. Are there some specific strategies you're considering with your own organizational resilience to encourage some of that, or is it something that's crossed your mind? How can we be more resilient as organizations to respond to these requirements in our community?
Yeah, I mean, we're in early stages of our resilience strategy, but certainly in Vancouver, as I mentioned earlier, we are responding to an increased frequency of emergencies, and they're not just all climate related. A lot of them are because of the confluence of stressors, of population growth, of increased activity at our port. And I think that certainly caring for our staff and engaging staff in this conversation is really important. The staff that responded, I don't know if Abby Bond is still in this room, she was here earlier, but our staff that responded on the front lines 2 weeks ago to the Balmoral incident, they were not treated very well. They were yelled at, they were spit at, they had cigarettes put out on their arms. Just that there was a lot of there's a lot of animosity towards our frontline staff, and so for me, that's personally, that is an issue that is near and dear to my heart, having come from the emergency management world. So needing to take care of our staff and make sure that they're okay, I think is really important with respect to organizational resilience. But also, I think another important part to that, and something that Vancouver is committed to, is partnerships. And I'm not just talking about partnerships to invest economically, but it's in partnerships with nonprofits, academic sectors, business sectors, to be able, and grassroots organizations at the community. It can't all be the responsibility of the city and city staff to advance these issues. We need to leverage the capacity that exists, and oftentimes it's not even the city that is the right group to lead a lot of these initiatives. So figuring out how to partner effectively doesn't necessarily always mean how to lead as a partner, but how to contribute as a partner, and how to empower others to lead where they'll be more effective.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, just to put it very simply, cities move at a certain pace, and the grant that we have, the grant agreement, is for 2 years. So if you want to accomplish something in those 2 years, you have to think about working with some outside partners and see what changes you can start at the city level that would say take effect at the end of 2 years. Whereas businesses, philanthropy, community groups, they can move quite a bit faster than that.
Thank you, Elliot.
It's one thing we haven't talked about a little bit about. One of the benefits of being part of the network, you'll hear reference to these platform partners. This is expertise and resources that we get from experts all around the world that we're able to get direct advice from, be able to engage them very quickly on specific issues, the likes of which they've probably seen in many, many different circumstances. It's not the traditional way of approaching problem solving, and so that is another great benefit of being part of the network.
Brad, you bring up a very nice point, which is the process of building your resilience strategy comes in many phases. And so what you're hearing here is sort of the green team, if you will. We're all in phase one, some of us just in orientation, as a matter of fact. And the goal is to have a resilience strategy built over the next year or two. At the city, we're trying to align ours with our next business planning process, which is meant to be in front of council in November of next year. So maybe, Katya, just any words of wisdom that you could impart on the Green Canadian team as we close up our panel discussion and get ready for questions.
Words of wisdom. I mean, I think part of this sort of intention behind the 2 years of grant funding, and really the impetus came from sort of the idea of a chief risk officer, a chief sustainability officer, the idea that you are breaking down these silos, right? That across the city you're bringing together people who are working in transportation, who are working in social equity, who are working on wastewater, who are working in urban planning. You're bringing them together under the sort of auspices of a chief resilience officer to begin to coordinate across all of these different silos. There's a tremendous amount of incredible work going on in all of these cities, right? And the idea is that if you get people in a room, you begin to break down these silos and look at these interdependencies. And look where systems are affecting other systems. It's really a systems approach. So I think the idea from the 100 Resilient Cities is that you would be able to develop a strategy within a year, but the strategy is really, it's sort of the roadmap again of what you want to do. It's encompassing all the other incredible work, as Katie gave sort of a litany of, that's already happening in the city. And the second year is really around implementation. And that's where it's exciting, right? We look to draw down funders. We look to connect cities with other opportunities. We have network exchanges around wastewater, around circular economy, around immigration issues with cities all over the world. So that's for us as really sort of the really exciting part when we get to launch those strategies and begin to start that next phase of implementation with cities.
Great. Thank you, Katya. And thanks to the panelists for opening up your minds, ideas, and thoughts. Okay, it's question time, and it's almost time to go home. I know that. So I'm going to bribe you. We have what's called the Resilience Dividend books. They're in my office, I won't lie, but I will bring them here. And if we can get a few questions from the audience, you'll earn a Resilience Dividend book, and we'll just make sure we get your name and get it to you. There, see how that worked? I know planners, you like to read. You're the first one up, go for it.
Thank you very much for the discussion. One of the comments I thought I'd put through too, which I've been following quite closely, is around the technological revolution. And there's been some recent papers out from the Oxford University, the School of Economics, I believe, and they're looking at the modelling to say that we're likely for the first time to lose in the next 20 years about 50% of the labour. And we talk about the divide between the poor and the rich. And I think the indicator's already out there, certainly in the US. If you have a look at their manufacturing, it hasn't necessarily gone overseas, it's been automated. And there's some really interesting research around it. So this is going to, if you look at history, when you get that big gap, we're going to end up in, that leads to things like revolution. So we need to be conscious and mindful of it, and certainly as planners. And I'm curious in terms of whether that discussion within the resilience of cities globally has been discussed in terms of the potential implications of technology. Thank you.
Sure.
Elliot.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that question. I'll just jump in because I had the opportunity to attend a small conference with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation called the City Exchange. We brought together 10 mayors, basically 10 VCs, venture capitalists, and 10 leading tech firms in the urban space. And we had a discussion on pretty much exactly that question, right? How will cities be changed by technology? My personal approach and philosophy to economics would be to reject the idea that because there's going to be an increase in productivity and a change in people's jobs, that will worsen the gap between the rich and the poor. You referenced the U.S. manufacturing sector, but the United States economy as a whole is at its nearest point to full employment that it's been in my lifetime. I think more interesting is to look at sort of the short-term and the long-term aspects of how tech would impact our city systems, particularly in a corporate sense. There's one side where the data is going to help us. There's a phrase called squeeze the lemon, right? So think about how we can do things like time lights or plan for construction and so on that will maximize productivity within the city system. And I think there's a longer term question which is really unanswered about how some of these technologies are going to change the way that we interact with our built environment. Vehicles are the most obvious ones. You could say on the one side that we should be planning for a significant increase in electric vehicles. On the other side, you could say that we should be planning for a significant decrease in the number of vehicles on the road because with automated vehicles, we'll need fewer of them. And we don't really know the answer to how it's going to pan out. So I think it's a really exciting question. Sorry to jump in ahead of my colleagues, but I think there's just, we could have a whole other 4-day session on that.
It's interesting, just on the very top part of your point, at our agenda setting workshop, it wasn't just some of us. At every table, it surprised me, but every table had IT security and hacking and the future of data and the security of data as being a significant issue. It was unanimous across every table.
I was interested to notice that there wasn't any discussion about energy and energy sources, and it seems to me like that's a root cause of at least not all, but many of the issues that that need to be dealt with through a resilience approach. And of course, in Calgary, it's an economic issue as well as a climate change issue. And so, is there any How does the panel see that fitting in terms of transitioning to less harmful forms of energy, both from an infrastructure perspective, but also I'd be interested in the Calgary perspective in terms of economic transitions and if there's thought being given to that question.
Brad, thank you.
For sure. One of the things that we've talked about here is that the benefit of the strategy is that it gives you the opportunity to align with other things that are already going on within your organization and your community. So 2 key strategies that we have going on right now is our energy management strategy, reducing our footprint, how we can increase the reliance of our major consumers corporately and in our community on different energy sources. And is Dick still here? Dick Eberson was here. He's actually leading our climate resilience strategy. So as Katya just finished saying is that what you've got in any organization is you've got one group that's working on a climate resilience package, you're looking at an energy group. What this does is puts a layer over it and says, you know what, let's do this in a coordinated way. And that's exactly what's happening at the City of Calgary. So you're right, we didn't talk about them specifically, but that's what the strategy will have to do, is talk about what are the goals of the community, Big changes, obviously, in Alberta with penalties and incentives to move away from coal. What does that look like? What does that do to our economics? How is that going to change the economics of a city? You can see the trickle-down effect. How is it to affect our downtown? If it affects our downtown, how does it affect our assessment base? If it affects our assessment base, what does it do for taxes? These are big puzzles. So I can tell you, at least in the Calgary's perspective, those are just two of the other strategies that are being integrated along with this resilience strategy.
Elliot?
Can I just add to that? I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I struggled with at the beginning when I started my sort of training with the 100 Resilient Cities, because when you think about it, mitigation actually isn't a part of resilience on its own, right? Decreasing, a power source that you were using doesn't necessarily make you more resilient until you think about co-benefits. And that's the approach that the City of Toronto has taken to date, to think about, for example, if you're using, what are the health benefits of mitigation? What are the financial benefits of mitigation? What about your decreased dependence on one particular fuel? So I think that's one approach that we can think about, how to draw mitigation into the resilience space.
This is an important question. Katie?
Oh, sure. So I think I probably just neglected to mention it because it is an issue that is so intertwined with the entire ethos of Vancouver and our plan that it just goes without saying to me that we're thinking about this issue. The city released earlier this year a renewable city strategy with a goal of operating, I think by 2050 on entirely renewable energy. There have been some challenges. As I mentioned, this is one of the strategies that people are telling us that they feel disconnected from. But certainly already Vancouver has set and is exceeding targets to lower carbon emissions. And I think it's important, though, to Elliot's point, being a renewable city is not only important for us because of the climate implications, but as a country, as a city with seismic hazards being such a huge risk, our reliance on oil and gas to power our most critical systems puts us at huge risk. So we need to figure out how to balance that. Currently, we're looking at a number of our new buildings that are going in will be operated by renewable energy, and part of the reason for that is so that in the case of an earthquake, we have systems that can get up and running, and we don't need to truck in gas from God knows where we'll get it from to power up the generators, to have safe places for people to stay. So there's lots of good reasons for co-benefits, but yeah, renewable energy is a primary feature of what Vancouver is already looking at.
This is a bit of an older question. We haven't really had a lot of discussion about it since the beginning of the time. FCM has our municipal infrastructure deficit in this country upwards of $120 billion, and that was even some time ago. Mostly within your communities, actually, the 3 cities that are up there. There's a few other to add as well. We're dealing with an 18th century tax system across this country for most of the municipal sector for your revenues, significantly less than what provincial and federal governments bring in. There's been no strong leadership on an urban agenda in senior government that I would point to over the past 3 decades. And as we've seen, we're starting to get to the end cycle of lots of our infrastructure. So what are you cities doing to try and end up more like a lasting London versus a dying Detroit when it comes to the hard reality of just simply money and providing your core services?
Thank you for the question, and it's a similar topic to what we heard from Chuck on the very first day. I think we're being quite innovative around capital in Calgary where we can be, Brad.
So the key for us is to have, and I think for everyone, is to have rigorous asset management plans. We started a number of years ago answering some of the basic questions. What do you own? What kind of shape is it in? What's the deficit? What it's going to cost? I mean, that's how you get to these FCM numbers on infrastructure deficits. And quite frankly, the answer that I'm going to give you is not a great one, only because right now the solution is purely throwing more money at it. Now there are billions of dollars being announced. They're not necessarily being sent. There's not any checks being sent, but billions of dollars are being announced over the next 11-year period for all communities to be able to renew their infrastructure. So you have to set some principles, and the principles at the City of Calgary and in the region is you got to take care of what you own first. It's very difficult. That is a difficult thing to do sometimes in a political environment where there's lots of pressure to cut ribbons and build new things. We are blessed by a city council, and have been for a number of years, where they understand the principle, whether it be on affordable housing. There is a big push to be able to go and get funding from other levels of government right now to be able to have them responsible for the assets that they own. For many years, the city has stepped in, taken some of our own money, used it to be able to use on assets that are on our own. It's time to rectify those kinds of things. The point of the resilience strategy is to change that kind of thinking. While that's critical, and resilience, the approach in these strategies is not going to change overnight, you've still got to maintain that infrastructure. It contributes to an incredible quality of life that we enjoy throughout Canada. So it's absolutely critical, but those are the basis of it. A strong asset management program, understanding what it is, being able to use the infrastructure money that's being announced in a strategic way, being able to make sure that you use it in a strategic way, but it really is also transforming our thinking about the assets that we build in the future, the sustainability of those assets in the future, and how our communities are most going to benefit from them. That change, that kind of thinking has to change into the future.
Thank you, Brad. And I think that is time for the panel. So I wanted to extend my appreciation to Katya, Katie, Elliot, and Brad. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ken, for the invitation.